politician who had legislative responsibilities, was going around the country making speeches, just extraordinary. He died, literally slumped on his desk after completing the last word of what should have been his last book, The Buddha and His Dhamma. He wrote the last word, and the pen was still on the page, and his head slumped onto the page, and he was found in the morning at his desk having died writing, which is an amazing visual image of this great writer as well. But he was the only man who continued publishing books after death, because they found more and more material amongst the papers on his desk, an unfinished memoir, Waiting for a Visa, it was called. There was another collection of some of his essays on issues. At least 3 volumes came out that had not been published during his lifetime after he died. So just this extraordinary figure. I can't talk about how much one human being can accomplish in a relatively short lifetime, because he died at 65. Ambedkar did it all. So I think there's a lot to appreciate in this.
Amazing. And I must say, looking out, look at this audience I was going to hold it inside. We were going to hold it inside. I think that wouldn't have been wise looking.
Well, I'm glad we got a private arrangement with the rain gods.
Yeah. This is wonderful. Look at this audience that you have, and to hear you, Dr. Taroor, being who you are, speak about Baba Saheb Ambedkar in that way, in the presence of the statue of Francisco Louis Gomes, who is the forerunner in many.
Gomes or Gomes?
Well, Gomes. Why don't you, Francisco? My Portuguese accent is not great, but we must hear his voice, his name properly. If you don't mind, Margarita, can you say his name?
Gomes.
There you are, yeah, Gomes.
We are going to, a big hand, first of all, for the moment. A big hand for yourself for being here.
And for listening so patiently.
In the middle of the afternoon to hear that absolutely brilliant disposition about Ambedkar. I really appreciated it greatly. We are going to take some questions from the audience, but first, if you don't mind, the Goa Heritage Action Group is going to come on stage for a second. Heta and Prita and Cesar, who have been...
I'm worried about the acronym. What is it?
Yes.
GHAG or
Yes.
GoHag?
I have never liked the acronym either, but nonetheless, please, Carlos.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I could also have everybody who's been part of the festival, Saloni, Darpana, Bhakti, Heta, Rohit Musorat, our young and handsome mayor. If I could have the residents as well, Senor Armand, Mr. Ribello, Mr. Bijlani, Mr. Joe Matthias. If you all could kindly join us here. If we have Dr. Bosue here, Dr. Shamin as well. Can you please join us here? This has been a wonderful
such a big
experience too, and we also would like to thank you for welcoming us into your heritage precinct. Please join us for a photograph.
It's such a pleasure and a privilege to be part of this, and it's wonderful to do that. In fact, when Vivek said he wanted to discuss heritage, I was sort of bracing myself for a learned disposition on museums or something, and we haven't even mentioned the word museum yet. So we'll come back for that discussion. Someone take a picture for me. Hey.
Excuse me.
Just come behind. Thank you so much, team Goa Heritage Action Group. We will take some questions from the audience. Dr. Taroor, we haven't talked about museums. There is one. We have a few. There is a very beautiful one just up the river in Old Goa. It's called the Museum of Christian Art. And we have...
How are the footfalls? I mean, I was a bit horrified to discover, for example, when I was doing a piece on museums myself some years ago, well, not that many years ago, that between 2016 and 18, so 3 years before COVID, the National Museum in Delhi had a total of 5.5 lakh visitors. Total in 3 years. Okay, whereas the Metropolitan Museum in New York gets 70 lakh or 7 million every year. So that's the kind of difference. There's something seriously wrong with our cultural sort of our attempts to preserve cultural heritage through museums, if that's all we're able to attract in terms of people. And it's partially perhaps because we don't do a good enough job of showcasing what we have to offer.
I think, it's a kind of a cliche, but we suffer in India from too much culture, right? I mean, we have, just here we have so many national stories within a country. And in Goa, it is the case. Look at this very large amount of very healthy, respectable audience we have for Dr. Shashi Taroor. In the evening, when there's music playing and there's food and drink, it'll be 3 times this amount. So there's something to be said about.
I should have learned the guitar.
Yes. A song, perhaps, Dr. Taroor.
So eavesdrop in the bathroom when you get it.
We have one more present for you. One of the parts of the festival is the revival and the appreciation of Kunbi fabric. We have can you bring the jacket now, please? So we have a stall here selling Kunbi clothes. Kunbi is the tribal weave, and she has a jacket for you, knowing your penchant for jackets.
You may have underestimated how overweight I've become. That looks great. Thank you.
Viva! Now everyone can take a photograph. Yes, we're going to ask questions in a second. The colors are great. They look really nice. Okay, we have some time for questions. I will favor anyone who has a book, but we'll start with Dr. Perez.
Yeah, so somebody was asking a question, I think, here. Or was it here? Sorry.
Is it? Okay, thank you, Professor Taroor, for your presentation, so stimulating. I would have a lot of questions to ask you, but I'll try to be as synthetic as possible. I will start with the Ambedkar. Indeed, even though I have most of your books at home in Lisbon, I didn't buy this one, and I will buy it immediately. But exactly for my PhD, I lived in a village of Gujarat, and at that time, I mean, in the last part of the 20th century, Ambedkar was not known. I remember that even at that time I was also at London School of Economics, that was not much about Ambedkar, even though there was, of course, an activist movement like the Panthers and so forth. What is for you the turning point that made now Ambedkar famous all over the world, even though sometimes without the data that you just mentioned and made him such a great, not only politician, but I would say humanist? That is one question. Well, as I said, I have many, but I would like to ask you another one. To me, heritage has inevitably a political dimension. When I compare Goa to Diu is under a severe destruction because it has no economic potential in the government, as opposed to Goa that became now a touristical destination. So, as a politician, how do you feel? Do you feel that you have a responsibility in the transmission of Goan heritage, of course, not only through your novels, but in other ways, of not Goan heritage, Indian heritage. Because now, indeed, all over Europe, and especially after the Ukrainian war, the image of India is dominantly about hard power or smart power. And, well, Indian culture, whatever the term culture means, it's too complex to be defined, is kind of hidden beyond this hard power and this partnership with India against China, blah, blah, blah. But Indian culture as such is not transmitted.
Interesting questions, both of them. On the Ambedkar thing, I think certainly it's changed. I mean, it's now estimated that there is no one in India who has more statues to him across the country. But possibly Mahatma Gandhi, and even that's debatable. So there is apparently no village in India without an Ambedkar statue. And that's partially, of course, a reflection of the reassertion assertion of Dalit pride. And they have chosen Ambedkar as the iconic symbol of their assertiveness, and that may be part of the reason. But he's often shown in his blue suit and holding a book, and the book is the Constitution. So it embraces both of those ideas. What has led to that is obviously the changing and evolution of our politics, and I credit Indian democracy with the fact that we've now seen Dalits leveraging their own vote to elect their own leaders. I mean, who could have imagined for 3,000 years a Dalit woman presiding over the heartland of the Indo-Gangetic Plain, the land of Aryavrata? And yet Mayawati was Chief Minister of UP 3 times, thanks to democracy, thanks to the system that gives her and others of her background that kind of opportunity. So I would say that explains it to a great extent. But then people discover more about Ambedkar and they realize he's more than just one thing, as I have tried to explain in the book. Then the second question about culture, the thing about culture is that it is sometimes transmitted deliberately by effort, by design, by conscious leveraging of institutions and practices, and sometimes by accident, despite anything. So ultimately, what endures in culture is what is transmitted without effort, is what goes on naturally between generations, what families transmit to each other. Sometimes individuals, not governments, will make the effort to revive. I mean, there was a real effort made under the British rule to rediscover Indian forms of classical dance, for example. Bharatnatyam was really not practiced until a serious effort was made in the late 19th, early 20th century to revive the art form, bring it forward. You found patterns of patronage changing. So in the old days, where the Maharajas would patronize musicians or court artists or whatever, and the Maharajas became extinct, today corporates are expected to do it. So the means, the vehicles, the resources will all change, but what is valued will continue because somebody values it and enough of others value it to want it to continue. And if it's not valued, it will die out. I'm sorry to say that in every culture, including something as vast and multifarious as ours, there are forms of expression, of art, of music, of dance, that are dying out, that we're not even aware of, because folk traditions, for example, there's some rich, immeasurably rich traditions in many, many parts of our country, whose practitioners have dwindled to a point because it's either commercially unviable or because people find it too difficult to make the effort that the previous generations had made, and then these practices disappear. So, in some ways, heritage is what survives in culture. It's not necessarily what is valuable, and that's where governments and conscious efforts, subsidies, sponsorship, support, patronage can help. But again, I mean, our country too, the budget available for cultural promotion is very, very modest. And certainly the central government's Ministry of Culture budget has been slashed in real terms year after year after year. I mean, once you factor in inflation, we have less money available today than for cultural promotion and for cultural support and for supporting artists, practitioners, in their old age and so on. Much, much less than we had in real terms 25 years ago. So I do worry about that. And as I say, some things may not survive because people didn't find the resources and care enough to help them survive.
We have a question here, and she has one of the more delightful books. Your Taroor.
Thank you. So Dr. Taroor, this is a very interesting story about how I picked this book. I have a 10-year-old son and he's into cars, dinosaurs, and he's like, wow, a new dino. and I picked it, it's very interesting. So my first question, I have two questions, please allow me. My first question is for early readers and for children, young adults, what would be your recommendation if they've never picked a book? What would be the first book that they should pick?
Anything that they find interesting. I have told parents I would not even discourage children reading comics. The idea is to actually have the pleasurable experience of holding a printed entity in your hands, turning the pages and getting pleasure. Because too many of today's kids, unfortunately,